Do you recognize them? Nope. In this particular case, this is actually a picture of a software development team in India. When I was a kid, there was a particular formula that they sold me on with respect to how you, basically how you grow up, how you become an adult, how you end up living a good, meaningful life. You go to school, you get good grades, do your homework, take your tests, etc. That will get you an opportunity to go to college. Once you've finished with university, you will graduate with a nice job, making, 70,000 US a year, right? That's a nice starting wage in the US. And at that point, you kind of decide what you want to do, get married, have kids, buy a house, blah, blah, blah. This system, this formula, is so deeply entrenched, at least in the United States, but certainly in a lot of educational systems around the world, that we have a number of tests, standardized tests that are designed to help reflect how well you will do in this particular system. For example, in the US, if you want to go to college, you have to take what's known as the Scholastic Aptitude test, the SAT. High school students in the US obsess over this. As a matter of fact, we even have tests that will help you prepare to take the test. It's called the preparatory SAT, the PSAT. And there are classes that will teach you how to take the PSAT correctly so that you can get a good score on the PSAT, which is the preparatory test for the test that will actually get you to college to take more tests. And then once you get to college, if you decide to go to graduate school, there's another test to see how well you can get into graduate school, the GMAT. And we just have tests everywhere. As a matter of fact, how many of you have ever seen American football? Big guys in helmets and pads and crashing around and so forth. They actually, when you are a college graduate and you want to go into the NFL, there's another test called the Wonderlic, which the NFL administers to test to see if you're smart enough to put on plastic pads and hit each other in the head. Think about that for a second. Point is, there's all of this test, there's all of this emphasis on this particular approach. As a matter of fact, when you were in grade school, age 13 or so, they actually have tests that are designed to tell you what you would be good at, right? So you take this test and it tells you whether or not you would be an author, whether or not you would be a good programmer. I took this test at age 13 and it told me I would be a good priest. We had this system and it was designed to help, to give us a progression, to get a good job, good career. But the problem is that formula doesn't seem to be holding true anymore. Now, it started in the US, and it started with all of this, the so-called outsourcing trend, but it's spreading. It's spreading all over the world in a lot of ways. Used to be that I could stand up here and talk about how India was the source of where all that outsourcing was going, but the truth of it is, a lot of it is coming out of India now and going to other places. South America is a popular choice. Eastern Europe, Russia is a popular choice. But in each case, as more and more outsourcing goes there, people start making more money. That starts to raise the cost of living. And this is starting to circle around in a lot of ways. It's becoming more expensive. And as developers, we have a little bit of a concern because, let's be blunt, if you can go find somebody that gets paid a lot less than me, then my job is potentially at risk. This is not the first time that we have faced a problem like this. You probably don't know who this is. This is actually a reference to a popular figure from the American West. His name is John Henry. He's been immortalized in song. Johnny Cash, the Man in Black, actually did a song around him. And John Henry is a figure. He's absolutely quintessentially American. He's an independent man. He's a strong man. He defies the system. In particular, he defies the automation that's coming his way. The story is, this is during the 1800s when America was still building the railroads out to the West Coast. And he was the phrase is a steel-driving man, born with a hammer in his hand. He would lay track and he would pound the nails into the track, or he could actually carve his way through a mountain, or so the legend tells. And there was a gentleman, the villain in the story is a gentleman from back east, that is to say New York. All the villains, by the way, in popular American folktales, all the villains are from New York, just so you know. This guy shows up with an automated steam-powered drill and says, I challenge you to a race. And John Henry says, yes, let's do this, let's race. Man versus machine. And so the story goes that in the early stages, the drill pulls out ahead. And so John Henry has to engage in further and further effort. And it's a close race until the very last strokes. John Henry, with just a mammoth effort of will, finally manages to beat the drill in this race and then dies. He managed to defeat the machine, but he dies as a part of the process. Now, I suspect most of you will be able to recognize this guy. You guys know who he is? Yeah, Garry Kasparov, considered to be the finest chess player of his generation, perhaps of all time. Guy's pretty good. When you can go for an entire decade without losing a match, that's pretty impressive. But he made the mistake, some would argue, that he challenged IBM's Deep Blue in 1997, or IBM challenged him. I forget who exactly threw down on this one. And Deep Blue, when he played him, it was a 5-game match. And supposedly the second game, the computer made several moves that he had not anticipated, and it completely rattled him. It totally threw him off his game, to the point where by the 5th match, he just basically tipped his king and said, I yield. Both cases, men of superior skill defeated by machines, separated by 150 some odd years. Automation is something that, quite frankly, as developers, we generally love. But when you start taking this all the way to its extreme, it starts getting very, very nerve-wracking. I mean, think about this for a moment. There are people, possibly in this audience, who spent long years of their career learning how to optimize assembly code. Anybody here ever written assembly, much less optimized it? Yeah, show of hands. How many of you have done it in the last 2 years? Really? What do you work on? What's that? Hotspot engineer. Okay, you don't count. But think about that for just a second. Those guys are making it such that we don't have to. They are the enemy. They are the reason that we don't have to. They are, by definition, taking away jobs from all of those engineers who would otherwise write assembly language by hand. Compiler engineers are the same way. What's that? That's easily, run. Run before he catches you. And quite honestly, right, we sit here in this room, programmers and so forth, and we're like, evil automation, kill the hotspot engineers. But this is not a problem that's unique to just us. Case in point, there was a medical conference a number of years ago where a doctor of a startup was standing up and showing off his X-ray analysis machine. And he was saying, look, you can take X-rays, lay it down onto what looks like a scanner, let it do its thing, several minutes go by, all of a sudden a piece of paper comes out through the slot, and it basically says, look, the arm is broken, and everyone in the, yeah, that's great, that's great, that's great. Then later they discovered that what this was doing is it was scanning the X-ray, sending it off to a doctor in India who was analyzing it and sending back the result. And everyone got really upset. Oh, that's totally cheating. That's not fair. Dude, that's an implementation detail. Whether the automation is happening by actual machine or whether it's happening by, lower paid individual, either way, as long as it's cheaper than me, then you don't need me. And it's not just us. As I said, doctors are facing this. Used to be that if little Johnny was coughing or was sick, you would take him to the doctor. And the doctor would say, take 2 aspirin, call me in the morning, send you home. Today, you don't even have to go to the doctor. You go to webmd.com. And WebMD says, your kid is not sick. Stop browsing. If you want to fill out a will, you used to have a family lawyer, at least in the States you did. You would call up your lawyer and say, hey, I want to fill out my will, or I want to change my will because my sister, she pissed me off. She's out of the will. Today, you go to LegalZoom.com and you fill out your will online there. You can fill out your will, you can create corporations, you can get divorced. It's cool. It's like Vegas in reverse. All of these websites, heck, today we have websites that'll help you meet people, right? Match.com, eHarmony.com. So now you don't even have to date anymore. You just go online and say, find me a wife, and boom, she shows up. It's awesome! Yay for technology. All of these things that we used to require people in our lives to take care of now are being done by software. You start following the trends and you start thinking, geez, at the rate things are going, what's left for humans to do? This is of some concern. And so one of the natural questions that sort of emerges out of this is, how do we stop this? There's got to be a certain point where it ends, right? There's got to be a certain point where we can say, no, humans can do that better than machines can. Truth is, we can't. Because frankly, there's a lot of things that machines do very, very well. And for us to just try to stand in its way means we're just going to get run over. So what can we do? Evolve. Any Battlestar Galactica fans in the audience? Yeah. Explain the joke to the rest of the room, would you? Do you know who this is? Probably not. But there's somebody like him in your office somewhere. This is the guy that you come to work at a new company. You sit down, you get your laptop, you get, login credentials and so forth, and you glance over and dude's just staring out the window, maybe looking at his phone, but he doesn't seem to be doing any real work. And the next day, and the next day, and the next day, you keep glancing over, and while you're starting to get into code and doing, pull requests and code reviews and talking with people about your system and whatnot, he's just sitting there. Doesn't seem to be doing anything. And finally, after some time, you work up the courage and you turn to one of your colleagues and you say, dude, what's up with that? Why does he get to just stare out the window and the rest of us have to actually work? And that's when your colleague says, shh, don't bother him. That's the guy who had the idea that made us $1 million. So just leave him alone. You can be him, because I guarantee you that when it comes time for somebody at the company to be laid off because of budget cuts, because of acquisition, because of whatever, it's not going to be him who gets fired, because he demonstrates deliberate value add to the company. You can be him. You can be that valuable character. You can have that idea that makes that $1 million, or that is the right solution for the problem that nobody else considered, or that designs the next really cool thing. Steve Jobs, perfect example. It's hard to remember now, but Jobs was originally fired by the company that employed him. That is to say, Jobs founded Apple, and he and Wozniak built a very interesting little personal computer company. And they got to a certain size, and the Apple board decided to fire Steve Jobs. Seems kind of crazy in retrospect. This man who made the company billions, if not trillions of dollars later, they fired him. They kicked him out of his own company. And so he went off and founded a new company, Next. Anybody ever play with a Next computer? One hand in the back. There's always one. It was a great machine. I mean, first of all, it was running on some really sweet hardware, and it had typically more memory than anything else that was being sold at the time, partly because it needed all that memory in order to be able to run. But it had this really nice, slick graphical user interface, had this really cool programming language, this really awesome development environment based around Objective-C. That was actually cool once. And they went nowhere. I mean, the Next machines were really sexy. They were awesome to look at. They also cost about 4 times what a PC cost, right? And the Next had to have its own monitor, and the Next had to have its own laser printer. Next was one of the first ones to adopt PostScript, which was great because that sort of set the standard for everybody else. But it was just not the incredible success that everybody really thought it might turn into, particularly Steve Jobs. He really thought this was the wave of the future, and it kind of turned into nothing. Well, Apple later came back and said, Mr. Jobs, we are so sorry. The company is dying. I mean, think about it. Microsoft they actually bought into Apple just to keep them afloat, just so that Microsoft wouldn't be sued by the US Department of Justice for being a monopoly, right? That's like, okay, no, seriously, stand up and let's play some more because I don't want people thinking I'm beating you up too badly. Apple came back to Jobs, said, please come back, take over your company. What's the first thing that Jobs wants to do? Well, first of all, he wants to bring all of this Objective-C interface builder over from the Next. Okay, Steve, if that's what you want to do. But the second thing he does is he jumps into the incredibly saturated world of MP3 players. Remember when we actually called them MP3 players as opposed to just iPods? And remember what was the most amazing thing about the iPod? We don't even care about it today. It was the click wheel. This little wheelie device that had a button in the center. And iTunes. The fact that you didn't have to worry about file formats. The fact you didn't have to worry about how to download music onto your device. The fact that what Jobs realized was that this wasn't really about devices. This was about an experience. This was about how do I make it easier? Because people who buy one of these, they don't care about lossy versus lossless compression and audio formats. They just want to play their music. The iPod, of course, became an overwhelming success. That led to the iPhone, which, of course, now led to the fact that there are iPhones everywhere, an iPhone Shuffle, an iPad, and blah, 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 blah. There was a time when if you stood up in front of people and said, I want to create a new product to go into an already saturated market, people would have told you you were crazy. And they still do today. Go ahead, step outside, go talk to some venture capital startup folks and tell them that you want to get into the wonderful world of programming languages and build a company around it. You won't get any money from anybody because that just can't be done. You cannot build a company off of a music player that will later become one of the most dominant personal computer entities on the planet. Can't be done. Jobs did it. He is what we refer to as an iconoclast. Someone who does something that others say cannot be done. The term iconoclast actually comes from the 700s AD. Actually, south of here, by a couple thousand miles, Leo III, who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the Eastern Holy Roman Empire, he's getting ready to be crowned king, crowned emperor. And you have to understand that in 700 AD, when you get crowned, when you get put onto the throne and given a crown, it's the church that does it. The Christian church, headquartered in Rome, the Catholic Church, it's a bishop Or it's the Pope himself, if you're important enough, who will hold the crown and put it on your head while you are on your knees in front of the church. The symbolism here could not be more clear. The church is giving you this power. The church is giving you this crown, this throne. Therefore, the church can take it away if they so desire. The church rules you. Anytime we want something, you will give it to us, etc., etc. Leo doesn't really like this model, and so he decides he's going to change the model. First of all, he doesn't have the crown given to him by a church officer. He does it himself, basically picks it up and puts it on his own head. Then he climbs up on the back of his throne and tears down the symbols that decorate his throne, the church symbols that decorate his throne. He is literally the destroyer of icons, which at the time, everybody said, can't be done, because if you do something the church doesn't like, they excommunicate you. They throw you out of the church. They say, you will not enter heaven when you die, because life in 700 AD is so terrible that the best we can do is hope that when we die, we actually go to a better place. Kind of like Detroit, Michigan, come to think of it. Since then, any time that we have somebody who is attempting to do things that others say cannot be done, that others simply say not possible, we call them an iconoclast. There have been a number of iconoclasts throughout history. And bear in mind, one of the things that we really want to differentiate is iconoclasts make the world a better place. There have been a lot of people who've gone off and changed the world in various negative ways. But we care about the people who actually made things better, who defied the system, did something different, and made the world a better place. Those are the ones we really care about. We've had a number of iconoclasts within our industry as well. Alan Kay is probably one of the more recognizable ones, simply from the standpoint that Kay is the guy who invented objects. Back in the 60s, he created Smalltalk. He invented what we now refer to as object-oriented programming. He is also the one who has the quote, "I invented the term object-oriented programming, and believe me, C++ was not what I had in mind." Linus Torvalds, iconoclast twice. Number one, because he released the source code to an operating system when everybody else knew that operating systems had to be built by big companies with heavy investment. And then later, he built a source control tool, decentralized in nature, when everybody knew that in order to do source control without any bugs or corruption, you had to have a centralized server. Linux and Git were both incredibly iconoclastic steps, both from the same guy. Score 2 for Linus. Dave Thomas, Ed Dijkstra, Robin Milner, all of these guys have done things differently within the industry that we just kind of assumed couldn't be done. So your goal, in a lot of ways, when you go back to work, is to be that iconoclast. Be somebody that does the things that others say cannot be done. Now, I suppose I could just stop here and say, okay, cool, bye, thanks for having me. But that's just kind of teasing you. Go do that, but not tell you how to go do it. The iconoclast does 3 things in particular. Number 1, you see the world differently. Number 2, you overcome some of the fear that comes with this. And number 3, you know how to exercise your social network effectively. Here's what I mean by these 3 things. Look up. You see those lights in the ceiling up there? Seriously, look up. Those lights are actually more powerful than your brain. Seriously. Your brain operates on about 40 watts of power. Those are probably 100-watt minimum light bulbs. Your brain, you are literally, all of you, me too, all of us are literally the dimmest bulbs inside this room right now. And the brain, by the way, has a lot of background activity it has to coordinate. It has to tell the heart, keep beating. It has to tell the lungs, keep breathing. It has to tell the digestive tract, keep digesting. has to tell the eyes blink and so forth. There's all this background activity that it needs to control. And so the brain starts looking for shortcuts. In order to do all this higher order thinking that we do, right? In order to be able to stand up here on stage and give a presentation, the brain has to look for ways to take shortcuts, how it processes things. And so it does so in very, very subtle fashion. For example, looking at that picture, how many of you see a gray triangle there in the center? Show of hands, pretty much everybody. What if I told you that there is not a gray triangle there in the center? That is actually 3 Pac-Mans sitting next to 3 XML tags. And you know how I know that? I made that diagram. And at no point did I put a triangle anywhere in the center of that. Now, you're looking at that and you're saying, 3 Pac-Mans and 3... No, dude, that's a gray triangle. That's 3 black circles, that's a white triangle, and that's a gray triangle. Stop lying to me. Because your brain, it's picking up on that pattern. It sees it very, very quickly, very easily, and so it latches onto that as this is what is really there. What this means, though, this is a very important realization, is that perception, these optical illusions that we love to play when we're kids and so forth, perception is a matter of the brain, not of the eyes. The eyes recognize data, but it's the brain that interprets that data. It's the brain that tells you what you're seeing. Perception is a matter of the brain, not of the eyes. And here's another one. You've seen this optical illusion before. You know intellectually that those 2 horizontal lines are in fact the same length. Agreed? Yeah. Okay, why does your brain, even though you know it, why does your brain still believe that that top line is longer than the bottom line? Perspective, but it's not just perspective. It's the history of perspective that your brain has. When you stand in the middle of a road and you see the edges of the road coming together off in the distance, and then you walk down the road and you realize that the edges of the road never actually get closer, you realize that that perspective is what's going on with your brain. And you stand at the base of a building and look up and you see its slope. Railroad tracks, so many different examples of where perspective, watching things go off into the distance, we see what we know are parallel lines slope together. Then we look at the edges, the distance between the horizontal line and the vertical ones, and we notice that the distance is much smaller at the top than it is at the bottom. So then we say, that must mean that the top line actually stretches closer to the parallel edge as opposed to the bottom line. And your brain, it's doing all of this in a flash of a second. This is a very easily recognizable pattern. Now, here's the thing. If we take away that easily recognizable pattern, it becomes much, much easier to spot that these lines are in fact the same length. If I take those vertical lines and flip them, is there any question in anybody's mind now that those 2 horizontal lines are the same length? Because your brain doesn't see this very often. Your brain doesn't see this. This is kind of a reverse perspective. If you're standing in the middle of the road and it looks like this to you, something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong. Like maybe you need to stop doing drugs or something. I don't know. No judgments. The key to take away from this little exercise is the realization that when you're presented with something, the most likely way that you will interpret it, that your brain will interpret it, is based on your experience, based on what you've seen. We've all seen streets, we've all seen railroad tracks, therefore it's very easy to interpret that first diagram. Second one, never seen it before. Brain takes more time to process it. So, when you are greeted with this diagram, what do you see? You see, holy shit, that's my application. And the best part is, I don't know what you work on. And I still know that's true. Because the left-hand box used to be a dumb terminal talking to a mainframe, talking to a flat file, and then it became a Windows client talking to an Oracle, or talking to a server, talking to database, and then it became web browser talking to web server, talking to database, and today it's mobile app talking to server, talking to database. This is, folks, this is the universal architectural diagram. Put this on your resume. You are now all architects. Perception is entirely a matter of the brain, but sometimes it gets a little bit of a helping hand. You guys know who this is? This guy's actually a very well-known Seattle resident. You may recognize him better by this, depending upon how much you're into decorative glass. His name is Dale Chihuly. And Chihuly, you'll notice from the previous photograph, Chihuly has a small problem. He's only got one eye left. Now, if you've never done any glass blowing, one of the things you may not realize is that traditionally glass is about achieving very nice symmetry. Decorative glass is about getting nice symmetry. Cups and bowls and so forth are supposed to be completely perfectly round. And that's very difficult to do when you only have one eye, because you lose the stereoscopic vision that allows you to perceive depth. And when the accident occurred to Chihuly, he actually got a double whammy, because first he got the accident that injured his eye, rendering him pretty much permanently blind in that one eye, but then he also went out and broke his arm. And again, if you've never done glass blowing, you may not realize that to do glass blowing, you have a very long pipe. Looks like about an 8-foot-long metal straw. And you put a glob of glass at the end, and then you blow through it in order to create a bubble. And that's how you start spinning the glass, and you start dealing in this extraordinarily hot oven over here, right? You got to spin it, and then you work with it and put it back in and spin it some more. It's almost impossible to do with only one arm. And so Chihuly was forced to take a step back. And he was forced to sort of reevaluate his life, at least while his arm was recovering. And he said, you know what? Since I can't perceive depth anymore, screw it. I'm not even going to try to. I'm not going to go for this perfect symmetry that I can't even accomplish anymore. I'm going to go try something completely different. And if you look at these pieces, you can see that a lot of that perfect symmetry is not there. This decorative glass does not look like decorative glass is supposed to look. But it worked. Today, he's quite possibly the most successful businessman artist in history, eclipsing even that of Picasso. Some of his pieces will actually sell for multiple millions of dollars. The dude has had his own show at the Louvre, the French Louvre, the one in Paris, the one that French people don't like Americans even going to go see. They invited an American artist to do his own display, a solo display at the Louvre. That tells you something. Do you know who this is? You probably owe your life to this woman at some point in your life. This is Florence Nightingale, the founder of modern nursing. But more importantly, she's also the one that realized that during the wars in the 1850s, supposedly, as the story goes, she was serving with the British Army during their escapades in the Crimea, of all places, bringing it home here. And she noticed that more British soldiers were dying in the medical tent than they were actually on the battlefield. And she realized that some of this was because doctors were not practicing some basic hygienic practices, like washing your hands. Now, you got to remember, in the 1850s, the camp surgeon, the doctor, was also the camp barber, because they both involve sharp cutting things. I'm not making this up. They were the same person. The guy cuts your hair and then takes the same pair of scissors and uses it during surgery. Basic hygienic practices not being followed. And so she went to the doctors and said, hey, we could save a lot of lives if you guys would just do blah, blah, blah. And Florence Nightingale, unfortunately, was born a woman. And in the 1850s, particularly in the medical profession, being a woman meant that you were already a fish out of water. No offense, ladies, but that's just the history that we inherited here. And so basically all the doctors told her to go take a hike. So Florence Nightingale went to the Queen of England. She petitioned and got an audience with Queen Victoria and said, by the way, did you know that the doctors are actually killing off your soldiers faster than they are healing them? And the Queen said, but men die in battle, you know, so be it. And she couldn't quite get the Queen to understand the difference between. And so in what we believe to be the very first documented instance of a pie chart, she drew it out for her and said, look, this percentage of men are dying on the battlefield, this percentage are dying in the surgical tent. And Queen Victoria went, I get it now. And then told the doctors, wash your damn hands. This forced the medical community to reevaluate a lot of their core practices and forced them to adopt more hygienic measures to the point where today, getting surgery is not taking your life into your hands. It's considered a life-saving practice as opposed to a life-risking practice. The key thing here in all of these stories is that the iconoclast sees things differently. They perceive something that others do not. They recognize something. Now, I wish I could give you more direction than just that. I wish I could say, yeah, if you like go out and poke your eye out, suddenly your code will make more sense. And I will admit there has been some code I've seen where I really wanted to poke my eye out after seeing it. But in a lot of cases, it's not even that you have to come up with something entirely new. In some cases, it's, hey, boss, I think that we could use MongoDB as a part of this project and have some really, really overwhelming success. And the boss says, relational database. You see it differently. You didn't have to invent this thing. You can just see that there are so many things that you could do better. So many ways that we could approach this project. We could approach the company. We could approach how we hire people, blah, 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 whatever it is. You can see things better. So cool, you're already one step down. But now comes the hard part. Do you know who this is? This is the American country and western trio known as the Dixie Chicks. In 2003, during a concert in London, the Dixie Chicks made themselves into iconoclasts without even realizing it. Because if you recall, during 2003, the U.S. was embroiled in the war in Iraq. And in fact, within the U.S., it's maybe difficult to convey, but within the U.S., country and western music is the music of America. Country and western stars are as patriotic as like mom and apple pie. Flags are flying everywhere. There's an incredible synergy, particularly in the American South. Texas, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, Tennessee. The Country Western Hall of Fame is in Tennessee, Nashville, right? The Grand Ole Opry, et cetera. Country and western music is a sort of uniquely American thing. And the Dixie Chicks are considered country and western stars. So during a concert in London, they stood up. And Natalie Maines, who was the lead singer, said, "We're ashamed the President of the United States is from Texas." Okay. In London, this was actually received fairly well, because a lot of Europe, fair to say a lot of the rest of the world, was not particularly happy with the United States for going it alone into Iraq. No matter how justified we felt about it, the fact is we did it as a unilateral action, and there were a lot of people outside of the U.S. who were really upset about that. So when she made this statement in London, everyone was like, yeah, okay, right on, good job, spot on, yes, let's have some tea, yes, excellent, excellent. But when they got home, it was a very different story. Death threats, continuous death threats. Not the kind that are like, I wish that you were dead. I mean, come on, you say that to an ex-girlfriend all the time, right? No, these were the serious kind of death threats that police departments take very, very literally. You will be shot dead at your show in Dallas. You do not get much clearer than that as a death threat. Round-the-clock bodyguard protection for all of them and their families. At one point, there was a radio station van, right? You're familiar with this, right? Radio stations will have vans that drive around to do various things at the community. Come on down, talk to us here, win a free plushie toy, whatever, whatever. Radio station van was driving down the freeway, and all of a sudden, somebody pulled up next to them, and while they're on the freeway, pulled out a shotgun and pointed it at the driver because they had a picture of the Dixie Chicks on the side of the van, and because the Dixie Chicks dared question the American president. They never recanted. The Dixie Chicks have never gone back and said, we're sorry, we apologize, we think the president may have been a good guy after all, etc. They've never recanted on that statement. And certainly subsequent events have led the rest of us to conclude that maybe President Bush wasn't all as great as we originally thought he might have been. But the music industry is very slow to forgive. 3 years later, when they released their album, none of the radio stations would touch it. It was death, it was poison, it was radiation, it was nothing they wanted any part of. And they claimed it was because the America had not yet forgiven the Dixie Chicks. Ironically, at the same time they were saying that America hates the Dixie Chicks, their album was the #1 download on iTunes. It wasn't America that hadn't forgiven the Dixie Chicks. It was all those people who had shotguns pointed at them. This is fear. This is the fear that comes along with being the nail that sticks out. But it takes on some more subtle forms too. For example, psychological experiment. I grab a random attendee and I put them on the stage here and I say, there are 2 urns in front of you. The one on the left has 9 white marbles and 9 black marbles. And the one on the right, it has an unknown composition. There are 18 marbles, but you don't know what the black-white split is. Make sense? So now I ask said attendee on stage, please draw a black marble from one of these 2 urns. If you do, I'll give you $5. Which urn do they choose? Everybody says the left. Well, there's like 1 or 2 rights out there just because they want to be difficult. Statistically speaking, most people choose the left urn. I say, great, 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 great. We don't have to actually pull out a marble. I just want to know what your choice is. But now, the urns are the same. I haven't touched them. I haven't done anything with them. But now I want you to tell me which urn you will draw a white marble from. Okay, that wasn't a joke, but I'm glad you're laughing. Left! How many people say the left urn again? Congratulations, you're all idiots. Seriously. Because here's the thing. When we were talking about a black marble, you looked at the left urn and said it's a 50-50 shot. And in the deep, dark recesses of your brain, you said, I don't know what that is. And I don't like ambiguity. I don't like the unknown. So therefore, my brain tells me that if I want a black marble out of that one, there must be more white marbles in that one. So then when I flip it and tell you to draw a white marble, what, somehow your brain magically converts the color of the marbles over there so that now they're all black? No, if you thought that this was a better urn for black marbles, then logically you should go to this urn for white marbles. You're being logically inconsistent. And it has everything to do with what's known as the Ellsberg Paradox. We don't like the unknown. You can see it. How many of you have kids? Show of hands. Excellent. Ever brought new food in front of the kids? Right? Hey, Matthew, try this. It's great. You'll love it. No. But it's new. No. based on nothing more than it's new, kids reject it. So then you try to make it less new. You say, oh, but it's got all of the things that you like in it. It's got milk, it's got eggs. No. This is my 16-year-old at home, by the way. And the funny thing is, when you finally convince, here's $20, kid, just try it. Make your mother happy. Oh, that's good. Do I get my $20 back? No. We fear the unknown. We have an ambiguity aversion. We don't like the unknown. It's too easy for our brain to spin up all these disaster scenarios. That's another form of fear. But there's yet another one that you got to be aware of. You recognize this? Do you know which one it is? Can you name it? It's a space shuttle, but which one? Remember, the US had a fleet of about 6 of them. How about if I show you this picture? Yeah, now we know. Now we know it's the Challenger. Interestingly enough, after the Challenger disaster, NASA and the US government conducted a post-mortem, a retrospective by another name, and they determined that the O-ring, right? I realize some of you may not have been old enough to remember this, but they conducted an investigation and discovered that there was a ring, a seal, on the side of the solid rocket booster that froze during the night, and then it didn't thaw. So it wasn't perfectly sealed. So when the solid rocket booster launched, this incredibly hot gas was basically projecting against this gigantic tank of fuel, which of course, Richard Feynman, the great physicist, actually led the committee that did the investigation as to what went on. And they concluded that the failure, the O-ring design, began with the faulty design of the joint and the failure increased as both NASA and contractor management first failed to recognize it as a problem, then failed to fix it, and then considered it an acceptable flight risk. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask you a question. If I said to you that there is a design flaw in the car that you're about to get in, that not only are we not sure it's really a design flaw, but we won't fix it, it will kill you, and it's an acceptable driving risk. How many of you are going to get into that car and drive? What's the price of the car? Russia, you have embraced capitalism. Think about that for just a second, though. A group of really smart people sat around in a room and said, it's not a problem. And then when it was pointed out repeatedly that it is a problem, they said it's too expensive to fix because the lives of 7 astronauts can be measured in dollars. And then said, you know what, the chances of it happening are so small that if they die, they die. But you can see this play out because what happens here is these people sat around in a room and nobody wanted to be the guy to throw the red flag on this one. Nobody wanted to be the one to stand up and take responsibility for what would literally be a millions, if not billions, dollars correction. Nobody wanted to be the one who didn't sort of go along with the group. It's called groupthink in psychological experiments, and you probably have seen it happen within your company as well. How many of you have ever done planning poker? How many of you have sat in a planning poker session where somebody says, all right, feature 172, what do you guys estimate? 2, 2, 3, 2, 5, 12. And everybody looks at the 12, and the 12's like, no, 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 no. Let's do this again. I grabbed the wrong card. I wasn't thinking about something. And when you do it again, now it's 3, 2, 3, 5, 2. Did the feature suddenly get smaller? And a psychologist from the 1960s conducted this experiment, or 50s, sorry, Solomon Asch. You get brought in for one of these experiments. They put you in a chair with 11 other people in the room. You're in the last chair in the room. And they say, congratulations, thank you for participating in this experiment. We would like you to tell us which of these 3 lines on the right is the same length as the one on the left. You guys got it? And the first person says A. And the second person says A. And the third person says A. A, 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 A. Ah. But that's because there's a whole bunch of you in this room. Statistically speaking, to the tune of about 88%, you'll say A. You'll say A. The fascinating thing was, we already kind of knew this, but when the psychologists interviewed people after this, they found that people had actually convinced themselves that A was the right answer. You know, I was sitting down here in the corner, my perspective wasn't really good, so it kind of looked like A could have been the right choice, maybe. In some cases, some people said flat out, A was clearly the right answer. But an interesting thing happened, because obviously, as you figured out, the first 11 people in the room are plants. They're there specifically to lay out the wrong answer to see if people will follow along. The interesting thing is, if they tell one person in that group of 11 to say C, A, C, A, now all of a sudden, that pressure to conform to the group is broken. And now, overwhelmingly, people will say, well, B. You don't even need that guy to agree with you. You just need him to disagree with everybody else. Because once one person disagrees, then all of a sudden the jam is broken. And now all of a sudden you feel able to disagree with folks. This is another form of fear. Because I don't want to be the guy sitting in a meeting room with everybody else as we're talking about whether we're going to use Hibernate or JPA. I don't want to be the guy to say, both of them suck. I don't want to be that guy, because then we have to come to some kind of consensus before we leave here, and it's getting on towards lunch. I don't want to be that guy. So which one sucks less? I'll just let other people figure it out. Maybe it won't be that bad this time. You're following into this particular experiment. This is part of the reason why consensus as a resolution mechanism sucks so terribly badly. Because if everybody has to agree before we can move on, the one guy who disagrees becomes like the company douchebag. And nobody wants to, because it's like, just go along with the rest of us, otherwise we will never leave for lunch. Part of the reason why this happens is because we as human beings are programmed to follow the herd. And by programmed, I mean you go back in our biology. You go back, say, 50,000 years. Primitive Ted is, hunting there on the plains. And all of a sudden, he sees all the other members of his tribe going that way. And Ted thinks, well, that way there's food and there's water, and all of them are going that way. What do they know that I don't? What are they aware of that I'm not? Because 50,000 years ago, if you guess wrong, you die. Right? You go over there and it turns out there's a saber-toothed tiger ready to gnaw on your bones, or there's an enemy tribe, or there's all kinds of things that could kill you. You're much safer going with the herd. So we do. We follow the herd. You've experienced it. You're driving down the freeway. And as or worse, you're stuck in traffic. And you see that lane over there where occasionally cars are just zipping by you. And you're like, I could take that lane, but everybody's going this way. Everybody here knows something I don't. What are those guys? Yeah, I'll play it safe. I'm going to stay with these folks here, because then as you go down, if you get into that lane and drive for a little bit, you realize, oh, no, those guys are just jerks. They're trying to get ahead of everybody before the 4 lanes collapse into one. So they're going to like try to cut in at the last second, blah, blah, blah. Now everybody's honking at you, etc. And you learn. Following the herd, good idea. It's a biological impulse that we're trying to fight here. And so part of the idea that a lot of geeks really get into is this whole emotions bad. If you feel bad, therefore all decisions should be made completely and entirely objectively, based on nothing but fact. But again, psychology tells us that in fact, without emotions, you cannot make a decision. We can't just turn them off. We can't do everything based entirely on logic and reason alone. Case in point, Hibernate JPA, for your particular application, how will you know which is the right answer, or even doing something else? You won't know until you actually try to prototype something out. And as soon as you do, a new version of one of them will come out. And now you have to reevaluate all over again. It's even worse with Java Web Frameworks. You need your emotions to make these decisions. You need to acknowledge the fear. You need to get past the fear. Henry Ford is, of course, one of America's greatest inventors. One who fears the future, who fears failure, limits his activities. Failure is only the opportunity to more intelligently begin again. You're not sure if something's going to work? Cool. Go try it anyway. Go see. Because what's the worst that could happen? You're not on the tundra. You're not going to get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger unless you get really drunk and wander into the zoo. Go try it. Seeing differently, overcoming fear. But now you have to do the third most important part. You have to try to convince your peers, your boss, the other people in your social network that this is a good idea. Do you know who this is? It's not me, I promise. This is actually David Hannemeyer Hansen, DHH, who is very well known for having created the Rails framework. And there are lots of good things about Rails. The whole convention over configuration, right? The fact that we're using a scripting language to build these applications, very lightweight, blah, blah, blah. I mean, in many ways, Rails helped kick off a lot of the lightweight stuff that we now embrace very strongly as a part of the Java community. But DHH himself, I don't really want to spread rumors, but the guy's an asshole. He is. That picture, this here, was from, whoops, going back. This here was from the Rails 3.0 conference, where they were introducing Rails 3.0. And the slides before this were, people have suggested we should do this for Rails, and we could do that for Rails, we could do this other thing for Rails, and here's what we decided to do. Bonk. And then he turned to the audience and said, we know better than you what to put in Rails. So stop talking. He said this at a conference, just like this one. I know better than you, shut up. It's kind of an asshole. Do you know who this is? Edwin Howard Armstrong invented FM radio. Had a good friend of his who was the president of RCA. Some of you may remember RCA as being a big media company back, around World War II time frame. Later, kind of went the way of the dodo bird. But at the time, RCA was heavily invested into AM radio. And Armstrong went to his buddy and said, dude, I've got something better. And his buddy said, no, you don't. Okay, how many of you have listened to FM radio? How many of you have also listened to AM radio? And how many of you think AM is better than FM? I'm looking for that one guy who's just, yeah, there you are. Don't kill the hotspot engineers, kill him. Actually, he probably is one of the hotspot engineers. It's that side of the room. His buddy, right? His buddy had an opportunity to get in on something that was really good and said, no, we won't. We're not interested. We won't go down this path because it's too expensive. As a matter of fact, RCA spent years coming up with bogus papers to try to prove that AM was in fact better than FM. Armstrong died on the 40th anniversary of his discovery, penniless and alone. And shortly after his death, radio stations began to embrace FM. He wasn't able to convince people that his thing was better, even though it very obviously was. This is what happens to the iconoclast. If you cannot reach people, if you cannot convince them that what you're doing is good, if I can't stand up here and show you and say, guys, this is what you want to do, if I can't get that message through to your brains, then I've just wasted a whole bunch of time. This is what's known as social intelligence. And yeah, you could wait until you die to see whether or not your idea takes off. Most of us would prefer to have some level of success bigger than that and sooner than that. How many people are art fans? These are two of the great masters, Picasso, Van Gogh. Is anybody here who doesn't think Picasso or Van Gogh is a pretty good artist? Just, you know, I'm giving the guy back there a chance to get killed again. Pablo Picasso, the greatest businessman artist prior to Dale Chihuly. In 1973, his estate was estimated at $750 million US. That's pretty good. Guy is credited with 13,000 paintings, 300 sculptures, and a lot of love. As a matter of fact, he was very, very widely loved, to the point where actually supposedly a number of the people he painted were actually lovers of both sexes. This was a guy who was just incredibly, incredibly adored. This is also a guy who would paint you at the drop of a hat. There is a picture from a White House dinner with one of the Marx brothers sitting there, and Picasso has a pen in his hand, and he's holding up one of the china plates, and he's sketching the guy on a plate and gave it to him because Marx sat down and said, I would love to sit for a painting for you someday. And Picasso said, do you have a pen? And did it right there at the drop of a hat. Van Gogh, on the other hand, Van Gogh had some social problems. Because, gentlemen, call me crazy, but cutting off your ear and sending it to the woman you would like to be your girlfriend doesn't work most of the time. And if it does, you're stuck with her. Think about that for a second. It's our anniversary. That's at least worth a foot. Van Gogh only had about 900 paintings to his name because he was very much the social recluse. One of them knew how to interact with people, knew how to get his message out, knew how to be socially intelligent. The other one didn't. And the difference is extremely stark. If you want to exercise this social intelligence, there's two things you need to be aware of: familiarity and reputation. Familiarity, how well do people recognize you? Reputation, what do they know about you? This guy, not Professor Snape. The guy who played Professor Snape. What's his name? Yeah, Alan Rickman. How many of you didn't know that? You knew the face, but you didn't know the name. Because Alan Rickman is one of the that guy actors in Hollywood. He's one of those guys that, yeah, you know, that guy from that movie. That guy. Philip Seymour Hoffman was another one. Familiarity is something, the amygdala, the brain, the lizard part of the brain here, we love that. This is why you go to a McDonald's in Moscow, you go to a McDonald's in San Francisco, you are getting exactly the same burger. exactly the same burger because they were both made at some factory someplace else. The brain likes familiarity. We want to be able to recognize. You want to be recognized. If you want to convince the vice president that MongoDB is a safe bet, that can't be your first introduction. You need to get to know him. You need to talk to him. You need to get to know people in the community. You need to get your name out there. Personal brand recognition. You want your words to carry weight? Then you need to be out there so people can recognize who you are. So the vice president says, yeah, I know that guy. He does some good things within the company. I should probably listen to him. But it's that second part, the reputation part. Because it's one thing to be recognized. Yeah, that guy who had a slide with "fuck you" on the slides. Okay, that's not always a good reputation, by the way. Believe me, I can tell you that's not always a good thing. It needs to be something that people can recognize and think good thoughts about. This is where the open source community is so powerful for us. Because you can build that reputation within the shadow network by committing code. People often come up to me, how do you get to be where you are? Well, how many talks have you given at your company? How many times have you stood up in front of anybody who would listen to talk about something? How many times have you been willing to stand up and speak at the user group when the scheduled speaker can't make it? How many times have you, don't. And if the answer is, well, never, start with that. How do I get people to accept my code is worth something? Well, how many open source contributions have you made? How many projects have you participated in? How many patches have you submitted? Well, none. Well, okay, start with that. Build your reputation so that when you finally want to convince people that what you're doing makes sense, you'll have the familiarity and you'll have the reputation. And people will go, interesting. MongoDB, huh? The iconoclast is just one way to weather the perennial gale of creative destruction. This is a phrase that a former U.S. Treasury Secretary used to describe what happens periodically within the industry, within various industries, that like a hurricane will come in and lay a city flat, like Hurricane Katrina did to New Orleans, and then allow people to sort of rebuild and be better than before. But it sucks for the people who are there during it, unless you have a way to survive. Our industry is constantly undergoing these things. First it was Java, then there was .NET, then there was Ruby, now there's Node. Oh, by the way, functional programming, NoSQL, cloud. All of these things are constantly rewriting the rules. Feels like you gotta swim for your life just to stay afloat. The way to get ahead of this game is to demonstrate that you have the ability to see things and do things that other people say cannot be done. You can convince the vice president to adopt Mongo? That means that he knows you. He's listening to you. You think he's going to fire you? Your job is to get out of here, see the world differently, overcome your fear, and exercise your social intelligence, and become an iconoclast. See ya.